And action. Ryan had a question about glycemic index, and I'm going to try to, I've done videos on glycemic index before. Check out DrRic tutorial, the glycemic index, and it should come up. And it's a great concept, but we're going to talk more about glycemic load. So if this is the first time you're finding me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. This is my high-tech advertisement. Subscribe button down below and then the alert button to find out when I put new videos out. I'm an integrative medicine primary care doctor, so I do the usual MD thing as far as seeing people in the office for stuff, physicals, colds, sports injuries, bad feelings, and I also will do the alternative medicine approach too. I have a lot of titles. I don't want to talk about all of them. I've done a lot of specialty training, but that's not important. What's important is my toolbox is rather large, and if I can come up with a different tool for everybody that comes in, cool. If I can just use my tools to come up with a specific template for somebody, that's even better. And that's what I want to do. Because as I'll mention, whether you follow glycemic load, whether you follow calories like everybody used to do back in the 70s and 80s, which got us to this level of obesity, or whether you follow ketogenic, paleo, Dr. McDougall's fasting mimicking, fasting diet, it doesn't matter. There's always successes you have with everybody's attempts. So there is not one that's better than another. Chris Gartner did study 4 different types, and he found that there was one that seemed to have a little bit more longevity than others, but for the most part, everybody usually conked out by 3 months. And most people would usually give up by 12 months. And that's not even reading the whole book of these things. So if you follow somebody just by watching videos like this one, that's a good intro, but you gotta read the ins and outs by reading the whole book. So insulin resistance diet usually refers to glycemic load. And glycemic index, well, let's just talk about glycemic load. So glycemic load is where you compile the indices for all the fiber, the glycemic index for your fiber that you eat, the glycemic index for the protein that you have, and the GI for the fats that you have. Healthy fats, healthy carbohydrates, and healthy proteins. And yes, I did mention healthy carbohydrates. And right now, I'm sure all you paleo guys are probably shuddering in your... So paleo, I have some patients that follow it, and it is a great concept. I think Cordain kind of... some of this stuff is conspiracy theory, but he does do a lot of quotes. But you have to be careful nowadays with everything that's available on Google Scholar or PubMed. Those are the reproducible evidence. That's the evidence-based medicine, but reproducible studies. You can't just go with a Joe Schmo who came up with one study and said that paleo is #1. So be careful where you get your information. Again, Google Scholar or PubMed. You just have to learn to read through the studies that you find on those 2 very reliable places for data. And if you don't understand some of the data or the statistics, then ask your doc. My patients ask me. I mean, I'm there for my patients when I try to educate them. I think that's how I got to this level of knowledge is my patients asked me questions, I had to look them up. I remember back in the day in the 90s when patients would bring in paper and print. That was before the internet got that big and before I had a computer. And I used to have to say, oh no, I gotta read about this weird stuff from China. But nowadays with all the information and the information highway, you can get gobs of information. But some of it is very credible, Google Scholar, PubMed. Some of it is downright stupid and dangerous, so be careful. Use your doctor or your references, good references, to figure out and filter these things. I act as a translator for my patients to kind of decipher this and tell them which way we should go. Anyway, I digress. So the glycemic load takes into account all the balances of the glycemic indices. The glycemic index, as I mentioned, was first put together by the dietitians in Canada. It's when the United States was kind of failing with our measurements. So the way we used to do it back in the 70s and 80s would be following calories and cutting out fat because fat was bad. That's why you had all the fat-free everything. I mean, even tar is fat-free, but that doesn't mean it's tasty. So I would say that if you're following glycemic index, and don't forget to watch my video, DrRic tutorial, glycemic index, then great, that's a form of measurement you can follow. Again, you should always have some reference points or maybe a registered dietitian to help you manage this. But when you have measurements and you take food out of its natural form, whole food, mostly plant-based dieting and nutrition practice, and you put it into cups, measurements, little containers, then it's easy to figure out how and when I go overboard. And sometimes that does help with a couple days to a couple weeks of losing weight because you control what's going in. Don't forget, you also have to burn this up. So what goes in does have to burn up, but that's the old-fashioned way of thinking about things. Because all of you know that even if you maintain this thing, as I mentioned, usually within 3 months, it's like, there's other priorities, so maybe I should think of something else to do. So that's why I think mindfulness is important, but this is not a lecture on mindfulness. This is just about measurement and glycemic load. So let's just recap this thing. The way the glycemic index works is you take a food group and you compare it to a standard, or that's the standard. Glucose is a standard. So you take a measurement of how much glucose you have. This is the guys in Canada. You drink it, you eat it, and then you see how long it takes to get into the bloodstream. That's the standard. Now, from that standard, every other food group is measured, but it's individualized. So if you know how fast it takes for a food to be eaten and then for it to show up in the bloodstream, you'll know how fast the bloodstream gets hit with a carbohydrate load. Now, if it gets hit with a carbohydrate load equal to that or compared to glucose, the higher the hit, the faster the hit, the more the pancreas has to work at moving insulin out and getting insulin into the bloodstream to neutralize that carbohydrate source and get it into the cells. When you get carbohydrates into cells, you have to have insulin because there's a lock and key that fits that little cell and allows the carbohydrate insulin combination to get in there. If the carbohydrate level is high in the bloodstream, that's kind of irritating. But it's only going to be high for a short amount of time, like in fight or flight. If you're in fight or flight, then you have to have accessible fuel. And you have to be going, and the average human can run about 30 miles an hour for about 30 yards. And then that's it. Muscles start to accumulate lactic acid, and then after that, you can't run anymore. So, and usually by that time, you've burned up all your glycogen. And now glucose, again, if it's in the bloodstream, it'll allow you to go a little farther, a little faster maybe, to escape that saber-toothed tiger 3 times a year. Now the problem is we're exposing ourselves to stress in the morning driving to work, and I have another tutorial I'm going to do later on about my drive to work this morning. Also problem solving when another problem comes up at work, or getting home, trying to get to sleep and you don't have anything to eat, and that's stressful. It's not stress like you're going to get into a fight, it's just a stressor. So the more stressors you have, the more stress response you have, the more you're going to need that fuel. So if you constantly have fuel in your bloodstream, then that's good. But if you don't have a true stress response and you're just doing your 8-hour shift or driving to school, driving to work, and yet you have this high amount of sugar or glucose in your system, that's not healthy. The carbohydrates that are floating around like that, the glucose eventually, because carbohydrates eventually get down to the form of glucose and fuel. Well, the higher the load, the more irritating it gets to the blood vessels, and that's dangerous in the long run. And also, the higher the load, the more the cells are trying to defend themselves against that shower of glucose, and they become resistant. That's what's called insulin resistance. So even if the pancreas can make a ton of insulin to match that high glycemic index food volume, these cells are going to protect themselves by not allowing the lock to work. That means that even if your pancreas has put out a lot of insulin and bound together with every carbohydrate molecule, they can't get into the cell because the cells have protected themselves. They don't want to be showered with a lot of carbohydrate/insulin complexes, so they close the door or turn the locks off. And then you wind up having this unresponsive or insulin-resistant body, and that's diabetes. Check out my video, DrRic Tutorial Diabetes, episode 1 and 2. So that's where the United States is. I mean, 1 in 3, actually it's 39, almost 40% of Americans are obese. And obesity, even if you don't have any symptoms and you're 20 to 30 years old, which I usually hear all the time, Oh, I've always been like that. I'll tell my folks that are on the heavy side, I'll say, hey, your BMI is a little high. For your age, you want to get that BMI down to 25. And they'll say, well, I've always been that way. And I'll tell them what the 25 number is for BMI. It's ungodly low. And I usually get that same, what? I've never been that way, not even in high school. But again, it's just a number. If we have a number to shoot for, then we have a destination, and we're going to work towards that destination. If you have some measurements as far as glycemic index, load, calories, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, fiber, you have a measurable amount of something that you can be accountable to or for. So, so the idea with glycemic load is that if you have one thing that's got a glycemic index that's high, which is bad, and another thing that's got a glycemic index that's low, which is good, sometimes if you mix them together, they'll balance out. So that's where, even protein will have a little bit of a glycemic index, so will fat, but the most glycemic index rises or numbers will be from carbohydrate measurement. And not all carbs are bad. There are some good carbs. If you follow Dr. McDougall, he really loves carbs, and he has some very successful patients that follow the carbs. Now, if you measure carbs, and I put down on my plate fiber on the big half and then protein and fat, well, fiber usually is mostly carbs, but if you look at the fiber content and the carbohydrate content of vegetables and fruits, the net carb, that's when you balance out fiber and carbohydrate, the net carbohydrate is actually pretty low. And that's where that concept of whole food, mostly plant-based dieting, eating comes from. And that's why I have to tell you, no matter what diet you tend to follow, it really, if you look at population studies like Dan Buettner came up with, some of the healthiest nations in the world eat a lot of food, and they eat a lot of carbohydrate. So what would be the answer for that? So the folks that hate carbohydrates or following paleo or keto, I would always support my patients to do that, but I'm just trying to explain the point that in some cases, to know glycemic load, to know glycemic index, to work with carbohydrates is still safe. I mean, there's two things. The French paradox is when the nutrition practices of France were found to be, well, kind of unhealthy compared to the United States if you did a head-to-head comparison, because they ate a lot of the things that we're trying to avoid. Fats, especially back in the 70s and 80s, wine, alcohol, carbohydrates, heavy carbohydrates. But yet, the French have a lower morbidity than the United States. That's why it's called a French paradox. They seem to eat a lot, drink a lot, and yet they have less heart disease than us. So we must be doing something wrong. And extend that to the Spanish paradox, where they fry a lot of foods. They fry with healthy oils, but they fry a lot of foods. And what are we told not to do? We're told not to fry in the United States. We're told to bake, broil, grill. That's good, but it's a little drying. And if you're from a Spanish inheritance or heritage, you might miss that frying stuff. And that's where, if you don't love what you're doing, you can't maintain this past 3 months. That's why it has to be rewarding. You have to have some form of satiety, some form of reward. And sometimes when you miss the food and the cooking from your homeland, it hurts. And it's like, damn it, I'm not going to do this anymore. So that could be only at times of the year when it's really depressing. But still, if there's potential for that to fail, I would want my patients to get on a nutrition practice of some sort and then see an endpoint. Again, see a destination. If you can get to the destination, cool. If you get to that destination, but then you come up with another destination after that. You daisy chain your successes. That's what I always call summiting. You get to the first summit, fine. Congratulations, good. If you didn't make it, then you reestablish why did you not get there, and you don't do the same thing again. And that brings me to a good point. When I hear somebody say, I know what to do, I just have to do it, I say, you don't, respectively, you don't know what to do. You have something that worked for you before, but if it didn't work for you or sustain you before, why would you go back to that same thing again? So please think outside the box. Even if it worked temporarily before, there's so many different authors to choose from. I mean, there's so many different successes, but you got to read, no matter what. I don't like to have people look at screens at night. This is how I get to sleep. and there's a lot of books. I have a lot to yet go through, but number one, they're kind of boring. Number two, it's very hypnotizing if you kind of read like this, and you flip the page, and you're reading and you can't really see, so you have to squint. That's me. But that also calms the brain down. And it's also fun. If you have a good author, it's pretty good. I'm still getting through his. He's pretty decent. So, bottom line, glycemic load, Ryan, is when you measure your whole plate. And that's what we want to do. You have to observe what you're doing with your plate. You have to see what the plate contains as far as little indices of different components. And you take the total and you make sure it's healthy and you eat it. And you eat it at the same time every day so your gut knows a timing pattern. Just like you go to sleep the same time every day because you see the sun when you wake up in the morning and you see the dawn when you go to sleep at night, or the moon when you go to sleep at night. So you keep that pattern up and you won't be so stressed out. You eat properly and you'll be able to build muscle. You build muscle and you can burn up more fat, more carbohydrates, get slim. And if you get slim, you'll feel good about yourself. So you invest again in better sleep, better eating, better exercise. It's a positive cycle, but it does take a little bit of planning. And if you're getting frustrated because you're not getting anywhere, get some help. Reach out to folks, whether it's going to a clinic like mine or reaching out to people online. I had a patient that came in the other day, and they said that they tried to call Fung, but you know, he's a very big author, and he probably doesn't answer too many of his phone calls. I'm sure he gets millions of them. Who has the time for that? I have barely enough time just to answer some of the portal messages I have with my patients if I want to get to sleep on time and eat my dinner on time, which is time for dinner. So I'm going to sign off at that point. Please don't forget to comment down below if you have any other suggestions or if you have any critiques. But I'll see you at the next tutorial.